Following the insane critical and financial success of the Lord of the Rings trilogy, it seemed like a no-brainer move to adapt Tolkien's other popular book in the Middle-earth series, The Hobbit. The idea was to make The Hobbit the next Lord of the Rings. The release of this trilogy was highly anticipated. And while I know that there are some Hobbit Trilogy defenders, I think the vast majority of us agree that this trilogy was pretty disappointing, filled with unnecessary characters, dumb side plots, a lack of a clear focus. In my opinion, the Hobbit Trilogy is a mess. Let me explain. Hi all, I'm the Grinning Critic and I love talking about movies with a grin. Unfortunately today though, I'm gonna have to talk about the Hobbit Trilogy with a frown on my face, as I'm not a huge fan of this trilogy. From the very beginning, I think the Hobbit Trilogy was conceptually flawed. As we all know, the Lord of the Rings trilogy was just an insanely long, epic story. But that trilogy had 3 books and over 1,200 pages of source material to work with. The Hobbit is just one book, only 300 pages long. So a story of this size really only lends itself to 1, or maybe at the most 2 movies. So the idea of trying to replicate Lord of the Rings with such short source material sets itself up to failure. So as a result, everything in this trilogy is extremely drawn out. Now, I haven't read the book, but I can tell from watching these movies that a lot of the things that happen in the movies were direct translations from the source material. At least, that's how they come across as. In film, you can convey a lot very simply through brief shots of landscapes and quick action sequences. But in books, it takes a lot of time to describe these brief moments without any dialogue. And this movie was seemingly unaware of the necessity for reinterpretation when you're taking a book and adapting it for the big screen. The movie spends way too long on these sequences. But even when you adapt everything from the book, there still isn't enough source material to work with. So what these movies ended up doing was adding in a lot of filler stuff, wasting time drawing out side characters who really weren't important to the overall story, spending way too much time building up to events, and just having a lot of really unnecessary conversation sequences or shots of characters walking through mountains. Even though the trilogy may be lacking in its needed meatiness, it fails to make up for this in its plot. I do think the central story of the trilogy is actually pretty compelling, but I think in execution it really fumbles. The lead character of this trilogy, Bilbo, is inherently broken. He starts off as this naive, socially awkward, unlikely action hero who seems destined for greatness. The trilogy ends with him being practically the same character. He hasn't grown or changed. He's just done a couple of battles. I think it really doesn't help that Martin Freeman was a really poor choice for the role. While he can play the character of a socially awkward, weak hobbit, you just can't buy into him being this action hero. He isn't depicted as a strong character, and he doesn't seem particularly skilled at anything. It's hard to really root for him. He's given practically no depth, practically no backstory, and he doesn't even change as a person at all, so why should we care about him? But the supporting characters, however, make Bilbo seem like a masterful, deep character. The trilogy fails to give you a reason to root for these characters, other than the fact that they are working with Bilbo, and therefore you should care about them. Throughout the trilogy, several of these dwarfs die, but because the screenplay hasn't given you a reason to care about them, their deaths feel meaningless. I suppose Gandalf is the only well-acted and somewhat interesting of the heroes, but the movies waste time giving him these unnecessary side quests that act as tie-ins to the Lord of the Rings. The antagonists in the trilogy, however, were slight improvements over the heroes. Gollum, in his limited screen time, has brilliant screen presence, largely due to a phenomenal performance by Andy Serkis. But I found it frustrating that the movies never explored the backstory of how he stole the ring. Smaug is a captivating character, elevated by Benedict Cumberbatch's incredible vocal work, but he suffers from poor character development. You don't really know a whole bunch about him, he doesn't seem to have any clear goals, any clear motives, and he spends his entire day just lying around a mountain of gold. Once Bilbo steals the Arkenstone from him, he gets annoyed, goes outside, and then dies almost instantly. And the orcs? Can they even count as characters? Because they practically do nothing. Also, they look artificial. Their designs are so lame, and they look plasticky, so it's hard to take them as serious threats to the dwarves. Speaking of CGI, this movie's action sequences are filled with them, so it's kind of hard for you to get invested in them, as there is this disconnect and suspension of disbelief. That being said, some of the action is pretty thrilling and pretty well filmed, but we get such an abundance of it that it's hard for you to take any of it that seriously. All around, this trilogy is just an absolute mess, but if I'm ranking them from worst to best, I'd have to go with worst being the Battle of the Five Armies. Because splitting a book into 3 movies was inherently a broken idea to begin with, It's in this trilogy conclusion that it shows just how bad of a decision that really was. As they've had to divide this book into 3 movies, this movie ends up being practically just a final battle, feeling like a third act to the previous movie that should have only been 20 minutes long, stretched out into a 2-hour, 20-minute epic. There is just so little story that the action becomes monotonous. As the trilogy has largely done a pretty poor job at building up to this battle, you don't feel the stakes that you're supposed to feel in this epic battle. Sure, there is some great action, with one really great scene involving a hero jumping across a set of falling bricks. Although that may defy the laws of physics, it still looks awesome, so who really cares? When this movie does come to its conclusion, it just doesn't feel rewarding for anyone who's watched it. Just a horrible movie that I view as beyond indefensible. Second would be An Unexpected Journey. Now, as the trilogy started, this was honestly pretty weak. There were some good scenes. On the most part, this film was rather boring. Nothing really happens in this film for a long time. There are way too many shots of our heroes walking across mountains. Also, this movie is by far the goofiest of the 3 Hobbit movies. There's a lot of weird, out-of-place humour involving dwarves, which largely fails to stick the landing, coming across as clunky and awkward. I'd say that this one is easily the most forgettable of the 3. And I guess there's an argument to be made that a forgettable movie is worse than a bad one. But the best film in this trilogy by a long shot is Desolation of Smaug. Now, as much as I've spent the vast majority of this video critiquing the Hobbit trilogy, this is honestly a good film. Sure, there's a stupid romance subplot, some really weird editing choices, characterization issues, but there's plenty to enjoy here. It's visually immersive, namely in this mesmerizing spiderweb sequence, the colourful hues and lighting pops, but this movie's main problem was being in the Hobbit trilogy. As an individual film, it's pretty good, but because it was a part of the Hobbit trilogy, it comes with its baggage of underdeveloped characters, a lack of substance, and no strong overarching trilogy narrative. But at the same time, it doesn't face the problems to the same extent that the other 2 movies did, largely because it's a middle chapter in a trilogy. It doesn't need to spend time developing the characters, and it also doesn't need to spend time closing out story arcs. Likewise, the story development in this movie is stronger than the other 2. There are clear laid out objectives, the movie has a clear 3-act structure, and there are some half-decent attempts at characterization. So in the whole, I think the Hobbit trilogy is one of the most disappointing movie trilogies of all time. This might not be an issue for you, but for me, I'm really annoyed that we didn't get Guillermo del Toro's version of The Hobbit. Partly because he's one of my favourite directors working today. I love his exploration of monsters in his movies. He makes beautiful, poignant tales about monsters, and I would have loved to have seen his take on The Hobbit, because I think his style really lends towards that sort of story, so I can't help watching these movies thinking what they could have been. Thank you so much for watching, and I'm the Grinning Critic, and don't forget to subscribe to me. It'll make me grin again, that's for sure.